Okay, it's official. Temperatures have reached 100 degrees in Austin, Texas, USA. Speaking of hot, in this episode, we have a topic many of you consider, I'm confident, will think is of the hot variety. Our very special guest, who has testified on Capitol Hill, will discuss what's going on in government purchasing. And I see the hands in the back. Yep, we all have suggestions for improving the process. We all have our own ideas on what should or shouldn't be going on when it comes to government purchasing. Jim Ward, get a load of this. Jim Ward is actually literally in our Austin studio, and Jim's going to come by to share, surmise, snicker, and snarl at the latest crazy bids you can win. I'm Bill Culhane, your humble host, appreciating having been given but trying to figure out the assorted mechanisms on this new chair I've inherited. And just to let you know, if I fall, have no fear. It's likely that I'll be able to crawl back in front of the microphone. Our guest, what a guest. She is a superstar at one of the leading law firms in the world. As a matter of fact, at last count, Mayer Brown is one of the 15 largest firms here in the U.S. Government relations and contracts is but one of Mayer Brown's practice areas, and you go to their website, a formidable list of specialties for certain. Marcia Madsen, a partner at Mayer Brown, is our guest, as I mentioned just a moment ago. Marcia has been with Mayer Brown for over 20 years, and I looked at her bio. I can summarize her list of accolades. It's beyond impressive. Her primary areas of focus are government contracts and litigation, which explains how one of our researchers, and great job, kudos to Braden, by the way. Braden came upon Marcia's testimony before the Subcommittee on Readiness and Management Support of the Senate Armed Services Committee. The appearance was from earlier this year. But anyway, back in January, Marcia called for federal acquisition reforms and, obviously, the big bid theory. We became instantly interested in delving deeper into what she had to say.
Marcia, as I just mentioned, off the air, so to speak, understanding you have a very demanding schedule. So thank you for sharing your insight with our audience. We appreciate you being with us.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Happy to do it.
I kind of joked at the start of this show, Marcia, that many people have suggestions on how to improve the purchasing process. There are a number of us experts out there. And when you talk about improving the purchasing process, we're not just talking about the federal level, but elsewhere as well. What about you, Marcia? What changes would you like to see from U.S. governments in terms of purchasing? I know that's a broad question.
Okay, well, it's a very good question, and you're right. It's not just about the U.S. government, although I think I will tell you our experience has been that the policies and practices that the U.S. government adopts typically find their way pretty quickly to state and local governments who figure out, somebody's done a lot of thinking about these issues and they adopt them or at least species of them. The kinds of things that seem to persist as issues over long periods of time for government buying and that make government buying somewhat different, but not completely different than commercial, are the importance of a government agency defining its requirements, whether they're buying a weapons system, whether they're buying more commercial products, whether they're buying services, being clear about what it is that the governments need is so that companies who are interested in that marketplace can look at an RFP, an RFI, and understand whether that's a good opportunity for them. So clarity and requirements, a transparent and fair competitive process also is really important. Again, when you're dealing particularly with smaller and medium-sized companies who don't make the government pretty much their exclusive source of business, having a transparent and fair competitive process that is understandable to people in the business community and that they feel like is reliable and has integrity are really important aspects. Something we're also seeing a lot more interest in, but it's been true since the mid-'90s, is an interest by the governments at all levels really, in using more commercial processes for acquiring at least goods and services that are more commercial in nature. Of course, commercial is always kind of in the eye of the user and the beholder. Something that might be commercial in many instances may in its particular application not be commercial. But generally speaking, processes that are less bureaucratic and more commercialized also are helpful, again, to folks who don't spend their life doing this kind of thing.
You mentioned the word transparency a couple of times a moment ago, and those are accountability and transparency are two of our favorite words here on the Big Bit Theory. As a matter of fact, we had John Hansen on last season on the show, and John has pretty much dedicated his professional life to talking about accountability and transparency in the procurement process. And so you use those words in your testimony as well. And when it comes to transparency, just one example that we've come across, and many are concerned about the privatization and transparency of government records. And of course, the Big Bid Theory, our show, that includes bid/RFP info as well. And you mentioned commercialization a moment ago, and most are aware, most folks listening to this show, there are private companies that track government bids. A number of public agencies out there are uploading their bids directly to those systems to store the records, and at times those governments may even pay those agencies little to none to store the info. Some of these private companies leverage the bid data for their own advantage, and of course that potentially makes the information easier to access for the paid client of their tracking service, but it limits what opportunities others can see. And so you said it in your testimony, Marcia, injecting greater competition into government contracting must be a top priority. So how concerned should we be about private control over public data? And just to go along with that, what about accountability and transparency in the acquisition system? Why is that critical to our national interest?
Well, okay, so let's talk about transparency. And it's very hard to have a really robust competitive process if the folks who are going to be participating in it can't tell what the government is buying and what the rules are. So transparency is pretty basic. We can talk about accountability separately here in a minute. And then a fair competitive process that's understandable, that's written in statute and regulation, that people can look up and they can see, okay, I understand what the rules are. In terms of data, certainly at the federal level and in virtually, I think, all of the states, there are good public record statutes, so people can obtain access to information, subject to certain proprietary type exclusions. So there are, I think you're right, a lot of companies who sort of collect this data and make it available, but really anyone can file a public records request and obtain data. The problem really with all of those processes is they're not very speedy. Mm-hmm. So the transparency in the competitive process needs to be from the government agency, being clear about what they're buying, being clear about their evaluation and selection criteria, being clear about their timing so that interested parties can tell what's going on and whether this is a good opportunity for them. As I said, we're seeing more interest in the government using commercial processes. Sometimes that what is commercial may be in the eye of the beholder, though. It's they're a little harder to define. The U.S. government has rules about acquiring commercial items and has a lot of actually legislation that's been enacted, including in the last couple of years in the National Defense Authorization Act, to promote more commerciality in government buying processes, at least on the front end. Once you're sort of past the front end, this gets to be a more complicated question.
Again, we kind of keep an eye on and speak with a variety of different people from different levels of business, and everybody just wants a fair chance in terms of winning government business, because we all know governments request and buy anything and everything, and so it doesn't affect one industry or a handful of industries. Of course, it's everything from the local locksmith to, you mentioned, producers of weapon systems. It's everyone.
And the things that go into weapon systems today even are a lot more commercial than they used to be, right? It's a lot of IT and software and computers, so a lot of it's more commercial than it used to be. some of the places that governments, I think, have trouble, again, requirements, development, who's making the decision about what is being acquired and how is it described to potential buyers, what are the rules by which the acquisition will run. But some other things that sometimes cause problems too are how does the government's interest in acquiring IP? How is it going to treat your IP if they're getting access to your IP? How bureaucratic is the process, and how much oversight is there for the process? At the federal level, there's all of these issues, including a ton of ethics issues that are addressed in the FAR, and we have a lot of ethics restrictions. We have restrictions on kickbacks. We have restrictions on how you deal with conflicts of interest. For former government employees, we have restrictions on procurement integrity. There are a lot of ethics restrictions at the federal level that sellers need to be aware of. So it's not really a place for amateurs. You need to be conversant with the rules.
That's a great point. And Marcia, I'm going to try to change gears here because I do want to go through your testimony in its entirety as much as possible and practical. Having grown up near D.C. as I did, it was many years ago. I don't want to date myself, but I understand, have a feel for how big U.S. government is, and of course there are a lot of people involved in the federal acquisition process. One-on-one conversations are great. Studies or those who conduct surveys that aren't always neutral and unbiased, those are sources for information, but you're more so in the trenches. What is your opinion on the status of the mindset and the challenges confronting the federal acquisition workforce? What are those people up against?
Well, bureaucracy. We had, just to give you a feel for this, every year, there's a National Defense Authorization Act. Title 8 of that statute traditionally is the title for acquisition reform or changes in the acquisition laws. Last year, there were over 100 provisions in that part of the statute alone. Other committees in Congress, Homeland Security, Government Affairs, have also jurisdiction to impact the acquisition laws. The federal acquisition regulation is 18 volumes, and it's growing.
Nice.
So there's a lot of complexity in the federal process, and as I said earlier, a lot of these processes also make their way down to state and local government. So there's a challenge for people working in the government and acquisition to be conversant with the rules, to understand government business practices, and to be knowledgeable about their ethical boundaries and restrictions as well. It's a pretty daunting task. And I think particularly with the emphasis on commercialization today, we've got a lot of people in the federal workforce who are good at acquisition, who are good at the federal rules, but who've never worked in the commercial sector. So they don't have a good understanding of how to do market research, or they don't understand business motivations to achieve efficiency and make a profit. And in many government agencies, there's concern when companies actually make a profit. It's considered improper. There are concerns about, decisions that are complicated that require the application of judgment because of the really aggressive oversight area and community we're living with. So if for a government employee who's dedicated and has a lot of integrity and is working hard, if a decision involves a difficult judgment call, sometimes what happens is that the safe avenue gets taken, even if it's not the best solution. So there's a lot of moving parts here for government folks who are working in acquisition, starting with just a huge volume of statutes and regulations that they have to be familiar with. The other thing that folks inside the government who are working in acquisition are struggling with is there are not enough of them. There just aren't enough people doing this, and there's also a generational transfer going on. So some of the folks who have a long history and a lot of experience in weaving their way through a lot of these requirements are retiring, and we've got a new generation of people. So that's a very interesting environment.
Many of those people are doing a tremendous job on behalf of the country. And as I look through your testimony, Marcia, and I've read over the release dozens of times, I admit. I'm that kind of guy. I just become enthralled, interested in something. And so I just kept reading through it. And as you've done so very well for us today, Marcia, to your words, I just kind of tried to picture when you were done with your testimony, as you pushed back from the table and headed back to your office, what was then and is your sense right now on whether those in leadership are committed to addressing some of these issues? Do you feel positive about the feedback you received, or are you kind of 50-50? Where do you stand?
People in leadership, I think, are very committed to assisting the federal workforce. You see that almost in every bill. There's training provisions. There's interest in making sure that there's access to the ability to learn and to grow in their profession. There's a lot of interest. If you look at last year's, in the 2016 and the 2017 National Defense Authorization Bill, there's tremendous interest in making the federal acquisition system more commercial. And based on everything we can see about what's going to happen, at least in the House bill this year, but I'm sure this will happen in the Senate bill too, that interest is going to continue. So the question is how to do it, and really managing the complexities of the regulatory process and the oversight process in doing it. So I don't think there's any question that people in leadership are dedicated to making changes and to making the system work better. And I think there are changes that have been made in the last 10 to 12 years that have had that effect, with no doubt. Agencies are better at requirements, they're better at competition, they're better at commerciality, but the spending has grown and the number of new requirements has grown, including a lot of the executive orders from the prior administration that really added a lot of burdens to the acquisition system. So it's really hard to keep up. So yes, leaders are committed. When you say, did I push back from the table? I didn't have any doubt about their commitment. But I think it's also a really hard task. And how all of these rules fit together, what the role of the oversight community is, how inhibiting the IGs, the existence of the False Claims Act, which is that statute doesn't require intent in the normal sense to prove fraud. Regulatory violations can be fraud. How all of that fits together is really complicated.
I keep having the word daunting flash before my eyes. A moment ago, Marcia, you mentioned going back 10 or 12 years. Let's go the other way. And this is what we kind of jokingly refer to as the crystal ball segment of our visit. In your opinion, Marcia, what will government purchasing look like in 10 years? No pressure, just kind of when you find yourself sitting around thinking about the days ahead. 10 years down the road, what will we be talking about?
Well, I don't want to be a pessimist. I can tell you what I hope we're talking about, which is a more commercial and transparent system that makes it easier, especially for the United States, to preserve its technological preeminence. I also think, though, that history is a pretty good indicator, and these are things that have been, we're used to enjoying technological preeminence, but acquisition and making it simpler and making it more transparent has been really difficult. These changes do not happen very quickly. So, there has to be a real dedication to simplicity, commercialization, and to taking, I think, a hard look at whether we've sort of gone overboard with investigations and, chasing contractors about every little rule violation.
Because I would think that takes money and resources to follow up, investigate.
Yeah, and I don't mean to denigrate it. I think there's, accountability is really important when you're spending the taxpayers' dollars. I think it's, the question is really where the balance is. And if you look at the reforms of the last 2 or 3 years, you look at the kinds of things that are being talked about this year at the federal level, they have a lot to do with attracting companies that are technology developers who are not in the government market, who may not want to be in the government market, to bring their technology, their abilities to the government marketplace. And there's some real barriers there. There's concern about, okay, what if I don't completely follow my contract? What if I don't follow a regulation? Is it just too hard? Is there too much extra cost and oversight in it? And maybe I just don't want to do it at all. And, the the investigatory community treating regulatory violations as false claims, accusing companies of fraud because they didn't quite follow a rule that's really a complicated rule. That's a real chilling effect, and so it's getting the balance right.
Very good words indeed there, Marcia. And on behalf of our audience, appreciate again so much you coming on. And also I want to add this. I want to thank Stacy Berkowitz from Mayor Brown for her help in coordinating the visit. And I just want to pass along to our audience real briefly that Mayor Brown's website is www.mayorbrown.com. And I've been on it a number of times in the lead up to our visit. There is a treasure trove of resources on that website. I encourage everyone to check it out. The firm is also on most of the notable social media platforms, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. I did want to ask you this, Marcia. If anyone in our audience would like to follow up with you or contact Mayor Brown, is the media contacts link in the newsroom the best plan of action?
Yeah, that's the easiest way to do it.
Very good. Well, we will make note of that. As our audience knows, we'll make note of that in the description of the podcast as well. So, Marcia, again, appreciate all that you do to try to keep up with what's going on and what is such a huge task to keep the acquisition process moving forward in a fair and transparent way.
Thanks, Bill. It's been a pleasure.
Jim, the Jim Ward is in studio, and just a moment ago, of course, we heard Marcia discuss accountability and transparency. Much of that falls under leadership, doesn't it? At least to ensure those ideals, concepts are understood, followed, put into practice. Jim and his, what do we want to call it, his unique style, recaps the relevant crazy bids that you can win. Jim, take it away.
Hello. Welcome to Crazy Bids That You Can Win. My name is the Jim Ward, and I come to you from the TBBT studios to give you this edition's Crazy Bids That You Can Win. Gather round, gather round, children, gather round. A tale to tell thee. This edition's Crazy Bids That You Can Win will make up for that. It coincides a lot with the amazing interview that Bill had just done with Marcia Madsen on basically ethics in the government, which is a very, very timely subject, and it was very, very easy to find crazy bids, or in this case, actually, it's a crazy tender. It's a tender.
That you can win.
The title of this bid, this is actually out of Ottawa, and it is for a values and ethics consultant or consultants. This bid really, this interview struck me on a few chords here. So you take these words, values, ethics, things of that nature, and it bothers me. It does, because I mean, we all know history was written by the victors, as was said by the great Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, or Winnie. It's true. It's true. And that has shaped the mores, the ethics. There's so many words for these. And the funny thing is, when I hear these brought to my attention, in my experience, it's always by somebody who uses them to mold the situation to not implicate themselves in whatever mayhem may have occurred, right? I mean, you never see somebody come out, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, right? You didn't have Jim Baker coming out saying, yes, I cheated on Tammy Faye, even though with that makeup, I'm not saying it's right, but even he didn't come out and say anything. It took years and years, and finally, he came around. So let's call it this sculpted morality, and I think it's even more telltale that there are governments actually needing consultants for ethics. I mean, good Lord, how far have we fallen? And so going back to my original point, though, whenever I hear these words, it's like the cliche, if you're pointing at somebody,
you have the other fingers pointing back at you.
So whenever I hear someone talk about someone being unethical or someone doing things underhandedly, which are baseless except to their end and unsupported, unsubstantiated, yet it's their ethics and their morality that's guiding the discussion, which could, in certain situations, be you, your life, what have you, being judged by this. So that's the big problem I have, and I think that's the huge problem in the government world. Just like Marcia said, transparency is... I'm so tired of saying the word. I don't think it'll ever happen, okay? I think there's too many moving parts. But I would like to say this on behalf of the very, very good government agencies out there. Okay, we only hear about the 0.01% of the screw-ups. We don't talk about the 99.99% of the successes. So it's not like they're out there just falling all over themselves being buffoons. I mean, it's not like they're an immoral, morbidly obese, poor man's Tammy Faye Baker who really, really likes animal sex. So transparency is the way to go on this. I couldn't echo Marcia's sentiments anymore. And actually, you know what? This is a TBBT first. I'm going to actually nominate Marcia to win this tender for values and ethics consultant because I think everything she said made sense, was spot on, and let's hook her up. Let's hook her up. So that will do it for this edition of Crazy Bids That You Can Win. My name is The Jim Ward, and
Crazy Bids, Crazy Bids, Crazy Bids, Crazy Bids.
All right. Take it away, guys. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you very much for that, Jim, and many thanks to you for downloading and following the Big Bid Theory. My email is bcallhane@bidprime.com, and Jim is jward@bidprime.com if you want to get in touch with Jim and talk all things crazy bids. The show's Twitter is @TheBigBidTheory. My Twitter is contract_hunter. JW is Jim Ward, the number 6. And don't forget, also, you can connect with us on Facebook. Thank you so much yet again to Marcia Madsen from Mayor Brown, for Jim Ward in studio, and to the TBBT staff sporting their Be Calm, Be Transparent t-shirts. Kudos to you federal acquisition pros out there fighting the good fight. Until the next episode, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
So much fun. We're having so much fun. Oh, much fun. Oh, much fun.